Welcome everyone to NSTA Web Seminars, where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Tonight's presentation is part of our series on the NGSS Crosscutting Concepts, and our focus today is on systems and system models. Our feature presenter is Ramon Lopez, and we also have Ted Willard online with us to provide information about the standards. My name is Bryn Slate. I will be monitoring the program, and we have Jeff Lehman online with us to provide technical support. Before we get started, I did want to remind everybody about the NSTA Learning Center, which is your online portal for over 10,800 resources for science educators. And as many of you know, we've got thousands of resources that are available to you for free. Those include lesson plans, journal articles, and interactive content modules. So check those out if you haven't browsed the Learning Center lately. Our community forums are a great place to connect with other teachers. And if you need help finding things in the Learning Center and navigating the tools, you can reach out to our online advisors who are available via our online live support button. Now, I'll also remind everybody about the free tools that are there for you to plan and document your learning and organize what you're doing and to reach your professional learning goals. All of this is available by going to learningcenter.nsta.org. And now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our presenters. First, we'll have Ted Willard from NSTA. He's the Director of NGSS at NSTA. And he'll be giving us some information about the development of the standards. And then Ramon Lopez is our feature presenter, and he's joining us from the University of Texas at Arlington. And so now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ted. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks, Bryn, and thanks for everyone being here. I'm sure it's either, the last few days of the school year or the first few days of the summer are not necessarily the time where it's tremendously easy to get on to do a web seminar, so thank you all for taking some time out of what I'm sure are some crazy schedules. Going to get really started here, just give you a general background. Those of you who've seen some of our other web seminars know I've done this at the beginning of many of them this year. To point out, there are sort of 4 organizations that have been heavily involved in the standards development: the National Academies, Achieve, AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and NSTA. And there's been essentially a 2-step process here. There's the development of the framework that was released by the academies in July 2011. It gave a big, broad view of what the goals were for science education. And then the standards themselves, a process which is Achieve is coordinated, but it's involved 26 states in pulling things together. Those 26 states in blue, the lead states, were involved in running the show in terms of the development of the standards. But now we're at this point that the standards are completed, and all states are able to choose to adopt them. We have some new news tonight, as I was mentioning in some of the chat, that Kansas is the 2nd state to fully adopt the standards. Rhode Island, a couple weeks ago, was the 1st. We also have the state of Kentucky, which their Board of Education has adopted the standards, but there are some other steps that the state legislature and governor are involved in. So those are the first 3 on the dock, and many more to come. Both the lead states, those in blue, can adopt the standards, but also can all of the non-lead states. So any state in the country is welcome to adopt these standards. Talk a little bit about the framework. The main key, the biggest element here, is the 3 dimensions: scientific and engineering practices, cross-cutting concepts, that's what we've been talking about tonight, and disciplinary core ideas, which we'll actually be having some web seminars next school year about. If you haven't read the framework, I strongly encourage you to do so. There's no real excuse. There's a free PDF available from the National Academies Press, or if you prefer, you can get a hard copy of the book from NSTA Press. I've been told it's great summer beach reading. Just sit there and unveil and understand the practices. Will be wonderful as you're laying there and soaking in the sun. So here are the practices, 8 practices. We had a series of web seminars last fall on these. You're welcome to go through and look at those, get some sense of them. Here are the cross-cutting concepts. We've had web seminars on everything here except now systems and system models, which we're focused on this evening, but patterns, scale and proportion and quantity, all of these different pieces that are not unique to life science or earth science or physical science, but cut across all of those different elements. And then we have the disciplinary core ideas, life science, physical science, earth and space science, and now in GSS, engineering and technology is serving alongside all of these other standards and being, I could easily say that NGSS are the first really full STEM standards. Here you can see those life, earth, and physical science broken down further, as well as engineering, into different categories. And so we now have to get to this area. Standards have been developed. People are starting to adopt, thinking about how they impact assessment, curriculum, instruction, and teacher development. And a lot of work in all of those areas going on. So here's an example of one of the standards. And we have a statement here: develop molecular models of reactants and products to support the explanation that atoms and therefore mass are conserved in a chemical reaction. And so what we have here, this statement pulls as a performance expectation. This is a description of what students should be able to do at the end of instruction. It's not meant to be a description of what has to go on in the classroom. Teachers are still totally free to develop their own plans about how to get students to understand different ideas, be able to engage in different practices. But this is what they need to do at the end of that. And so we can see how it pulls together different elements here. There's this idea of developing molecular models to support an explanation, and that's further described down here. There's the ideas about chemical reactions, having reactants and products, that atoms and mass are conserved in a chemical reaction. And then there's this aspect of matter being conserved, which is a cross-cutting concept in the area of energy, in the area of energy and matter. And so we have this idea of conservation in place. And so all those different elements come together and are assessed within this performance expectation. And so with that general overview for you all, I'll pass things on to Ramon, who can talk about, I think, firstly I'll say as a former physics teacher, systems and system models being what I consider to be one of the really key cross-cutting concepts. Passing it to you, Ramon.
Thanks, Ted. Greetings, everyone. I see that we've got 80-some people in the room, and I assume that you're scattered throughout a variety of time zones. Yes, I'm going to talk about systems and system models in the NGSS. I'm a physicist. I'm professor of physics at the University of Texas at Arlington, which is in Dallas-Fort Worth area. Arlington is between Dallas and Fort Worth. And I'm primarily a space scientist. That's my research area. But I also have had a second area in which I do a lot of work, mainly physics education and science education generally. And my connection with the NGSS is that I was one of the leaders of the writing team for the NGSS. And it's been quite an interesting experience. And when we think about systems and system models, the whole process of developing NGSS was really quite a tremendous system that had to work together, and you had some of that sense from Ted's material that he presented early on. Now, systems we find everywhere in life science here, organs of the immune system, in engineering, how do you get electricity to your house to operate all your devices, Earth system and Earth system modeling. And that's very close actually to what I do. I do modeling of the space environment and the system of interaction between the solar wind and Earth's magnetic field that leads to things like magnetic storms. And actually that's part of my work, is space weather prediction. And there we very much take a systems approach. So let me ask you, how familiar are you with the framework and the NGSS? And here are A through E, and why don't you go ahead and think about it and vote.
So Ramon, I'll get the poll set up here, but I wanted to ask you if you could just turn up the volume on your mic a little bit. We've had a couple of participants saying that they're having trouble hearing you, and since that does vary across systems, even though I can hear you, I know that some of them may not be able to. So you can pull up the volume there a little bit, and I'll open our poll.
All right, let me go into my computer system preferences and turn up the sound. Let's see.
Okay, great. So while you're doing that, we'll have folks respond to the poll here.
Is this okay? Is it get louder?
To me, it sounds good, but I'll ask our participants to, the ones who could not hear, if you can let us know in our chat window if you can hear Ramon any better now.
How's that?
All right, I've got a couple people saying sounds better, so great. Thanks. And folks, if you want to turn up the volume on your end as well, that'll help you. Perfect. Thanks, everybody.
Pull it up just a little bit more. I didn't want to have it up too high because I was getting too much. I was getting some red in the setup. But is this good for everybody? So somebody asked if I can speak for a few sentences, so I'm happy to do that. And I see people saying much better, good, sounds great, excellent. So I think we're in the sweet zone, right? Good.
Yes, thank you so much, Ramon. And so folks, we'll go ahead and if you haven't had a chance to respond to the poll yet, it's under your own name at the top of the participant window. And it looks like we've got most everybody in there was able to pick a poll response. So we'll go ahead and close the poll now so we can take a look at a graph of everybody's responses. I'll put that up on the screen here, Ramon, so you can see what everyone said, and I'll fit that in with our choices. And I'll turn it over to you to discuss the results here. Okay,
so all of you have a little bit of familiarity. You've browsed documents, and it really is a lot to read through. I do recommend that you read through the framework to get a sense of where this whole thrust is going, because the framework really does lay out in a nice way how scientific practices, the cross-cutting concepts, and the disciplinary core ideas are supposed to be blended together. And it talks about, to some extent, about progression through the grades, and it organizes the framework organizes that in grade band endpoints, and that was where we started with the NGSS. So the challenge for the NGSS was to take the framework and to turn it into something that could eventually guide instruction. Now, when you do take a look at the NGSS documents, I want to reiterate what Ted said. Those performance expectations in the upper box are what you expect students to be able to do after instruction. Now, the performance expectations are tied to content and to some cross-cutting theme and to a particular practice. But that one practice that is called out is not the only thing that you would do in the classroom in leading up to that performance expectation. But that is the practice that will be assessed. The performance expectations are a guide to assessment. They're not, strictly speaking, a guide to instruction. And you can look at that and you can sort of start to think about what kind of instruction you need to provide. But especially with the practices, don't think that if developing models is the only practice that's listed there, that that's the only thing that you should be thinking about doing in the classroom. I mean, all kinds of things might require investigations. You might do investigations and then analyze data, and then from that you might develop a model. But it just so happens that it's just the developing model that's called out as the particular practice that's to be assessed in that performance expectation. But the background is going to be a lot broader. Again, those PEs are where does instruction lead you. So I am glad to see that a lot of people have already looked at at the framework. And we even have a few people that were part of state NGSS review teams, and to those folks there, the 5 people who said that they were part of that, thanks. I know it was a lot of work for you. It was a lot of work for us also to go through your comments and incorporate that into the NGSS, but it was an essential part of the process. So let's go on. What grade level is most relevant to you? Here's another poll. Give me a sense of the audience and how to tailor my comments.
So Ramon, we'll give just a few moments for folks to respond there, and I'll remind everybody where those poll buttons are located. They're right under your own name at the top of the participant window. If you've just recently logged on with us, you'll find the poll available at the top of the participant window. And we've got almost everybody with a response here, so we'll just hold on another 10 seconds, give everyone a chance to choose a response on our poll button so that we can count you in our aggregate that we will post up onto the whiteboard now. And back to you, Ramon.
Okay, so yeah, it looks like middle school and high school is predominating here, although we have a number of elementary folks. One comment I'd like to make, I'm just sort of watching various messages come through the chat window, and somebody wrote, well, I'm in Texas and we're unlikely to adopt, and that's absolutely true. Texas will not adopt NGSS. They just recently adopted a new set of their own state standards, and Texas, we used to be our own country after all, right? So we won't necessarily adopt anything that anybody else does. But don't, if you're in a state that's not going to adopt NGSS, don't worry about that. I would still recommend that you read the framework, because the framework is a general vision of science. And even if your particular state doesn't adopt NGSS, the framework and the NGSS will eventually influence science education in your state. And the kinds of ideas that are laid out in the framework and pulling together these different themes that run through science are important, whether you're an NGSS state or not. So just take a look at that framework, and I think you'll find it useful in your own thinking about what is science and how do I try to translate these important pieces of science into the classroom. All right, so let's go on. Again, those elements are blended in the framework. The disciplinary core idea is what normally people think of as the content. And that's where a lot of, state standards are or were in the past, that it was a list of content. But you don't have just content. You have these science and engineering practices. How is it that we as scientists actually do things? And finally, these cross-cutting concepts that cut across all of the areas of science. You find these things in every area of science. Every scientist looks at patterns. Every scientist looks at cause and effect and mechanisms and explanation. I mean, this is something that cuts out across all of the sciences. In fact, right now I'm in D.C. and reviewing proposals for NASA. And these are the kinds of issues that we've been talking about. Have proposers in their proposals talked about the mechanisms, and are they going to be able to distinguish cause and effect as a result of their investigation? So this really is how scientists organize a lot of their thinking. Scale, proportion, and quantity, systems and system modeling that we'll talk more about today, energy and matter flows and cycles, structure and function, stability and change. These are things that cut across all of the sciences but are really very important in the sciences. Now, energy and matter is a little bit different than the other cross-cutting concepts, because energy is also a disciplinary core idea. So that's the one that you find in both areas. Okay, so why are systems and system models so important? Well, every interaction involves two objects. An object by itself doesn't do anything. You have to have two objects that interact in some way. Maybe they exert forces on each other or something. But all interactions involve at least two objects. In other words, a system. So at the very moment that you posit that anything happens, that there's any interaction, you're already dealing with a system. And the universe is really big, and we can only study small bits of it at one time. So we try to organize pieces of it as systems. And then there are different things that we do with those systems and ways that we think about those systems. Like, for example, the climate system model, that you're dealing with atmosphere and ocean and ice, and you're looking at how all of these things connect to each other. And those are the pieces that all are going to influence the climate. And another thing about systems is that sometimes what we will do is we'll idealize. You don't necessarily always deal with reality, because reality is extremely complex. Reality is extremely messy. And especially for physicists, we tend to simplify a system so that we can get a handle on it, so that we can treat it in some way and identify its most important parts. So, for example, this is a physicist's cow. For a physicist, a cow is a sphere that isotropically emits milk. That's the system. That's the cow. That's reducing it in some way to what might be important, particularly if you're a dairy farmer. But that's the way that a lot of scientists will use systems, is that they'll try to use a system or a system model to simplify a very complex situation into pieces that can actually be handled and addressed, particularly quantitatively, so that you can gain some understanding, and then you go back and take that back to reality and see if that's giving you an understanding of the real situation. So how comfortable are you with the notion of systems and system models? I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then you can answer in your poll.
And the poll buttons are now open and available for everybody under your own name at the top of the participant window. I know we've had a couple of folks join us just in the last minute or so, so if you want to jump in and give us your response to this poll, let us know your comfort level with this particular cross-cutting concept. And we'll give just another few seconds for folks to respond before we close our poll so we can take a look at everyone's responses. Thanks everybody for your quick response. Tina, the poll buttons are at the top of the participant window right under your own name. You'll see a button that has an A on it, and you can mouse over that and pick from the choices there. And we've got most everybody in, so we'll go ahead and lock that poll and put up our responses. So it looks like we've got a range here, and I'll turn it back over to Ramon to discuss.
Okay, so this is good. A lot of you feel comfortable with systems and system models. That's very good. Ted made a comment about the physicist's cow system and said about how about taking in water and oxygen. Well, that actually illustrates another thing about system models, that it might depend on the time scale in which you're looking at things. You know, if your model of a cow is going to extend over an appreciable amount of time, then yeah, you got to worry about food and water and things like that. But if your model of a cow is really centered around going in the morning and milking the cow, you don't have to worry about those things, and you're again back to the spherical cow that just emits milk. So what you put into a model depends on a wide variety of things, including the spatial timescales that you're considering. So let's go on here. What are the features of a system? Well, all systems are defined by boundaries. And all systems also have components And all systems have to address flows both in and out of the system and within the system, and also interactions. And those are sort of the essential features of any system. And we always begin when we start thinking about a system in terms of defining a boundary. And that boundary is really going to be very context dependent. Now, sometimes the boundaries are rather self-evident. If we consider our solar system, the boundary of our solar system is called the heliopause. That's the edge of the region of space that is dominated by the solar wind and solar magnetic field, and it contains all of the planets. And so that's the bubble in the galaxy that is really, directly connected to the sun. And so that's what we call the boundary of our solar system. So that's an obvious physical boundary. But these boundaries can also be conceptual, and they may take odd forms depending on what's important. What are the features that you're trying to identify as your system? But you'll always have a boundary within which there's what you've defined as your system and a set of surroundings that may or may not interact with the system that's inside the boundary. When I deal with students, particularly introductory physics courses, these are 13th graders, right? They're not too different from the high school students, and they've now come to university and they're taking their first university physics course. And I find that these students have real difficulty in thinking about the boundaries of the system. And we try to get them to recognize that we try to isolate something and deal with, for example, when we're dealing with force and motion, what are the objects that are involved and what are the forces on them, and try to isolate that from everything else so that you can deal systematically with those objects and be able to determine the motion of those objects. So again, sometimes those boundaries are obvious, like in the solar system, that we've got the sun and the objects that orbit the sun and the region of space that's controlled by the sun's emissions, the solar wind and the plasmas and magnetic field in the sun. But those boundaries can be flexible depending on what it is that we really want to worry about. So let's say that I wanted to worry about tides. Well, the most important thing for tides is the Earth and the Moon. Now, the sun also influences tides. So my system for tides could be Earth, Moon, and Sun. But really, to first order, if I want to consider what's the most important feature here, I really don't have to consider the effect of the sun, because most of the effect is controlled by the moon. And so I can define the Earth and the Moon as my system if what I'm looking at is tides. So again, depending on what it is that I want to study, that's going to determine my boundary. On the other hand, if I want to consider seasons, well, then what really matters is the Earth-Sun system. And that is the system that I have to analyze and look at to determine what's the origin of seasons. So boundaries in any kind of system are flexible and completely dependent on what kind of question you're asking. So for any collection of objects, depending on the question, you might have some objects over here in this system, and another time I'll have another set of objects or things in this other system, and it really depends on the question that you're asking. Now, in the progression of the cross-cutting concepts, the notion of what students should be dealing with the system does change over time, as you would expect. And in that progression, explicit definition by students of a system boundary is part of the 9-12 grade band. Now, that's not to say that there isn't implicit definition of system boundaries at earlier grade levels, but really, you know, saying to students, okay, what is the boundary here? Define the boundary of this system. That's actually a rather sophisticated concept. As I said, students coming to university have difficulty with this, and it's something that we work at in those introductory courses. So that's where it appears, that explicit definition of boundaries in that 9-12 grade band. So what I want to do is stop right here and let you all think a bit about determining system boundaries and what questions do you have? Bryn, how should we handle this? They can just type up their questions in the chat window and I can answer them as they come along?
That's right, and we've also got Ted online with us to identify anything that he may have seen a little bit earlier in the presentation.
So just as a starting point here, there was a little bit of a conversation in the chat. Elaine had brought up this aspect, maybe it's useful for you to discuss a little bit about, you know, if you're interested in spring tides and neap tides, don't you need to include the sun? I think was the implied question there, but I think that gets to your point about the boundaries in some ways are context dependent, if you want to elaborate on that.
You know, if you're going to start learning about tides, and tides, let me tell you, are a rather complicated issue. Because, okay, people here are tides are caused by gravity. Well, yeah, but it's not purely that. It's actually the rate at which gravity changes over distance. It's the differential gravity that causes tides. So tides are a non-trivial concept. And if I'm going to begin discussing tides with students, I'm just going to use the Earth-Moon system, because to add the sun is to complicate the situation. Now, if you want to get a full description of tides, then of course you need to add the sun, because it does have an effect. So the boundary that you put on there really depends on what you need the system for. Now, somebody asked here, what is the boundary of an estuary? And somebody else responded, depends on your question about the estuary. And I would say absolutely. That's really what this is about. So those of you who are dealing with high school students, that, you know, if they come to you and ask you, well, what's the boundary here? You know, how do I define the system? Turn it around to them and say, well, what is it that you need to know? And then what's important? And include the things that are important. And are there other pieces that are really not that important, but that don't necessarily need to be in your system? Or, you know, are there natural physical boundaries that would delimit your system? Okay, coming from California, I'm concerned how this can be assessed. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question, because how a cross-cutting concept will be assessed is going to depend on the context of the practice and the disciplinary core idea. So the thing to do is to look at a particular performance expectation that is related to systems and system models, and then think to yourself, how would I assess the student being able to do this in its totality? Now, somebody else talks about here social studies. And yeah, if another field has got graphic organizers and other tools that you can use, hey, I'm always happy to steal from other things. Edward Robinson asked, what would be the boundary of a chemical reaction? It's not the boundary of the chemical reaction, but rather what's the boundary of the system that's involved in the chemical reaction. And what I would say is that whatever the chemicals that are reacting, I mean, that defines your system.
And
Christian says, how do you define a system? A system is at least two objects that are interacting. That's really the fundamental notion of a system. And then it can get much more complicated if you've got very complicated systems. You think about our bodies. Our bodies are incredibly complicated systems. And we can delimit that system, just by, our skin or whatever, and say that everything inside is part of the system that makes, Ted Willard or Ethan Allen or Elaine Wu. We can talk about the Elaine Wu system and all of the pieces in there, the various organs that are functioning to keep her alive and all the other parts in there. And that's an extremely complicated system.
Would you say that, that question again of how you define a system, it seems to me, based on what you're saying here, that the way you define a system is in many ways by drawing a boundary, by just describing it, and that boundary, I think I see it as it's that dotted line you draw around something, or the solid line you did in pieces, or sort of a three-dimensional bubble that you put around something, and you decide where it is and what's in it and what's not in it.
That's right. Now, Cindy Renee Trujillo here is talking about the energy flow and whatever is outside the reaction, and we're going to come to this issue of flows, because sometimes when you define a system, that doesn't mean that it's isolated. I mean, there are isolated systems, and then there are systems that are interacting with their environment, and things come in and out of systems. Yes, Myrna, absolutely. If you're interested in energy transfer, your system can be a room or it can be the entire universe. I mean, the universe is the biggest system that we can, in principle, define. Who knows? There may be more. There may be multiple universes. I don't want to get into the whole multiverse theory and things that people talk about in that regard. But let's go on. I think we've had a number of good questions and observations. I hope everybody is reading these chats as they come on, because there's some good stuff in there. All systems have components. Here, this is an actual picture of the Earth-Moon system from the Galileo spacecraft as it had done its Earth flyby on its way out to Jupiter. And the Earth-Moon system, well, the components are the Earth and the Moon. But all systems have components, and that's one way in which we define systems. So, for example, a climate system has got a variety of components that are illustrated in this particular diagram. And implicit in some of these things are mechanisms, like it says greenhouse effect, greenhouse gases. Well, that implies some kind of mechanism that deals with flows within the system. And components themselves can have components. So if you think of a computer, if you've got a desktop computer, you've got the main box, and then it's plugged into a monitor, and then you've got some kind of input device, keyboard, mouse, trackpad, whatever. But then within that main box, there are going to be various components. There's a central processing unit, that does the calculations. There are going to be memory chips. There's going to be disk drives. There's going to be power supply. There's going to be input-output devices. So there are going to be pieces within that piece. So that's another feature of systems, is that components can have components, and you can start talking about systems and subsystems. I would be very interested to see what excuse, or how a student tried to use multiverses as an excuse on the final exam. And again, just sort of looking at what's going on in the chats there. Now, components of systems lead to sometimes unexpected behavior. Scientists call these behaviors emergent phenomena or emergent behaviors. So sometimes a collection of objects that may actually be operating under very simple rules will manifest extremely complex behavior. And you see here, a bunch of little fishes in a school mimicking a big fish going after, presumably a predator of the little fish. That would be a very interesting emergent behavior. But actually, reality does mimic cartoons at times. Here you see a lizard that's been overcome with ants. And, I can't say for sure because I didn't take this picture, did the ants actually kill the lizard or did they find the lizard and now they're going to, cut it up and eat it for food. But certainly, ants are a very, very good example of complex behaviors arising from simple interactions because ants have got tiny, tiny little brains and then they communicate primarily through chemical messages. And there's a very simple set of these chemical messages, and then they respond instinctively with hardwired patterns of behavior. And even so, you can get incredibly complex behavior out of ant colonies that sometimes even mimics human behaviors because ants will some ants actually practice farming. There are ants that raise essentially mushrooms underground. That's their main food. I mean, it's really quite remarkable what ants can do, even though they are very, very simple creatures. And think about army ants. I mean, there are sometimes cases where, in fact, the ants can become the big predator and go after large animals. So that's one important thing about components is that you can have very complex behavior that arises in systems from relatively simple interactions. Now, students in the progression in NGSS, students will learn that systems have parts in K2, and that's just a very rudimentary notion that there are parts of things that might work together. And they have a sense of this already because these are things that you encounter in the material world all the time. For example, if you're a kid and you play with Legos, you're very familiar with the idea of something being built up of parts. In grades 3-5, students start to discuss system components in a little bit more idealized and abstract way. And then by middle grades, students are now talking about subsystems, understanding that, say, within, let's say within the digestive system, you've got the stomach, but the stomach itself is composed of other things, cells mainly. So you're building up this idea of systems and its parts and subsystems within systems incrementally up through middle grades. So what do you think are some of the challenges in getting students really to take a systems approach, systems thinking around phenomena in the material world, stuff that they might interact with or instruction that you might provide in classrooms? Now, Ross Smith asked a question here, which I do want to address, whether systems should be taught separately or integrated. It's very difficult to teach about systems completely in the abstract. It's much better to be using it as a way of organizing concrete observations. Because again, even at the university level, students have difficulty with these ideas, and they're still getting used to defining systems, identifying boundaries, and using that as a way of organizing problems. So what do you think are some of the challenges? Okay, so I'm seeing a number of things, mainly the whole boundaries issue, which certainly is a problem. And here says Ethan Allen says teachers themselves probably haven't thought about it in this way, and that is an interesting question because I don't think that a lot of science education is taught from this this perspective. Even at the university level, even though some of us, like me, will try to stress the notion for students of taking a more systems approach, it's generally not something that is explicit in a lot of the curriculum. Okay, defining boundaries. Rebecca asks, are systems discussed at the end or the beginning of the lesson? Well, again, ideally, it should be something that is woven throughout. And it's going to depend on the specific content. For example, if you're dealing with body parts and how organisms work, well, it's very natural to talk about systems in that context, particularly when you get into the middle grades and you're talking about things like the digestive system or the respiratory system or the circulation system. And let's see. Ricardo Miller says students tend to be nearsighted and don't want to see the big picture. They want to study concepts and take a test and then forget the information. Well, hopefully, if they start to develop coherent conceptual frameworks around ideas, then they will be less likely to forget information. Somewhere else I saw a comment, is it fair to say that in the framework in NGSS that everything has got to be taught integrated with everything else? And that's not an unfair assessment. Really, you should be thinking about weaving all of these things together all the time in instruction. When students are taught something as a bunch of isolated facts, it is very easy to forget those isolated facts. What we should be aiming for is the development of coherent conceptual frameworks. When you've got that kind of framework, then any new knowledge that comes in has got a place where it can hang on and is actually less likely to be forgotten.
Yeah, that's I think a great point, Ramon. I was just sort of check. I mean, it's not necessarily that, or this is my understanding, and I'm asking for some clarification here, that you still can frequently deal with certain individual ideas, a core idea, a cross-cutting concept, maybe not so much a practice, but at a given moment you may be focusing on one of those things. But as opposed to sort of traditional instruction where you may just focus on this thing and then move and focus on another thing and then move and focus on another thing, I think NGSS is trying to pull that you really, once you focus on something, one of the aspects you deal with that idea is how it's connected to other elements. And so you take the time to pause and draw out those connections. So it's not just this, isolated pile of sticks, but it's something that's actually formed a structure.
That's right. Yeah, it's not the knee bone is connected to the leg bone, and that you're memorizing names of a bunch of bones. I did that actually when I was a middle school student. I remember we had one piece of instruction where basically we were just supposed to memorize names of a bunch of bones. And what was missing was how do the bones fit together, and what does that mean for, say, walking? So when we think about the skeletal system, that's different than just a collection of bones.
And so, I mean, one of the pieces where this really kept connected with me at one point was, you frequently see an instruction about human body systems, since you're using the skeleton system, that, we go and we label all the parts of the circulatory system and the respiratory system, and we go and also label all the parts of the digestive system, without ever thinking about the purposes of each of those systems and how they actually support each other in an overall function of getting cells the materials they need and getting rid of the things that cells don't need. And then they seeing that and thinking about that more in a systems way made it so much more interesting to me than just here are all the parts.
Right.
Fill it out on a worksheet.
Okay. And now Lori Lancaster is asking about physical models, drawings or diagrams. What about mathematical models? And we are going to get to that because I'm going to spend some time specifically talking about system models, which I'm not really focusing on right now. But Lori, that's an excellent point, and we will get to it. Systems will have flows in them, and this is part of what we have to think about in terms of interactions. It's both interactions within the system and interaction between the system and its surroundings. And here I've just drawn the system of vortices that we have in our atmosphere that lead to the various wind systems that we see, like the trade winds, the westerlies, and the polar winds. And that's just a physical diagram. The system might have things that come in from the outside. So, for example, I could define my ecosystem to include the sun, but I don't necessarily have to do that. I could say that an ecosystem contains producers and consumers and decomposers, and that these pieces interact with each other, but the sun is something that is separate from that system. And that now I have to consider what is the flow into the system and what is the flow out of the system in terms of heat, for instance. So when we think about systems and their interactions, we have to think about how there might be matter and energy flows within systems, as well as matter and energy flows in and out of systems. And that actually gets us pretty close to another cross-cutting concept, energy and matter flow. And here's another example of a system, one near and dear to my heart, namely the sun. And we can think about flows within the sun. And we can deal with pieces of the sun as subsystems. For example, a sunspot. You can do studies of just sunspots and then say, well, what are the flows that are coming into the sunspot, and then what stuff that might be coming out of the sunspot. So yeah, flows in the system is closely related to this other cross-cutting concept. And so the cross-cutting concepts themselves will sometimes bleed into each other. Cause and effect. I mean, that's sometimes we define systems in such a way as to isolate cause and effect. What questions do you have up to this point? And we're going to go into system models in a moment. But here Malcolm Pringle says Earth as a climate system is a good example of a closed system because the only thing we have coming in and out is radiation. And by and large, that's correct. there is a little bit of mass that comes in, you know, because you always have some kind of dust, comets, and things like that that are hitting, but it's pretty much closed system. Cindy asks about assessment boundary for the DCI. I'm not sure exactly what you're getting at, Cindy. However, if you take a look at any of the performance expectations, you've got the major piece in the performance expectation, but then there'll be a smaller text in parentheses that accompanies that, and there are two pieces that will be in there. One is a clarification statement that might clarify the intent of some aspects of the DCI, and the other is an assessment boundary. And those assessment boundaries are written as negative statements, so that the boundary is you shall not go beyond X. Okay, so let me go on to the notion of system models, because system models can work in lots of different ways. And we have this idea of a system, so we might identify a particular system, and we might look at the flows within the system and flows in and out of the system, and our boundaries of the system are going to be determined by the physical phenomena that we're looking at. There may be natural boundaries. Those boundaries may be determined by the time scales that we're going to consider. So, you know, again, for example, a predator-prey system, if you're looking at it over very, very long periods of time, you have to worry about issues related to, you know, long-term behavior of the plant species and things like that. And you would have to include some pieces that you wouldn't have to include if you were dealing with predator-prey relationships over the course of the day and trying to define that as a system. But whenever we create these systems, in part we're creating some kind of mental model of that system. And oftentimes we use those mental models to idealize or simplify the system, just as they did with the physicist cow. And physicists do this all the time. I mean, this is what I do. I create mental models, and oftentimes, you know, those mental models are created in such a way that we can look for cause and effect relationships to really test whether our understanding is correct or not. You know, in science, many people can do controlled experiments, but not all aspects of science allow for controlled experiments. So, for example, geologic evolution is not something that is amenable to controlled experiments. Astronomy is not really amenable to controlled experiments. Neither is space weather, solar-Earth interactions. You know, the sun does what it's going to do, and I can't, you know, control that directly. But I can create a mental model of how the system should work, what should be these kinds of interactions, and then I can test that by going back into data and looking for particular sets of conditions that my system model would predict should behave this way or that way, and that way I can test to see if it's really correct or not. Now, not all models, well, models can take all different kinds of forms. Obviously, there's the mental models and conceptual system models, as we see here. In a conceptual system model, I think, well, what are the important pieces and processes here? What do I think is going to be really important for cause and effect that I can lay out? And that might be my conceptual model. Physical models are, of course, going to be very popular in lower grades because they're immediately accessible in concrete. Although you do have to be a little careful because, for example, if I look at this physical model, well, actually the relative sizes of the planets might not be so bad, but boy, their relative distances are really way off. And I can create mathematical system models. So here I've got a system of a wire that's wrapped around a metal core and it's hooked up to a battery and it makes an electromagnet. It's going to pick up a number of paper clips. So how could I make that as a mathematical model? Well, I use Ohm's law to say what's the current given the voltage and the resistance. And, well, what's the resistance? Well, it's going to be the length of the wire times some, resistance per unit length of the wire. That's going to be the total resistance. So now that tells me how much current I've got in my system, and I might make an argument that somehow the number of paper clips is some function of the current, and that might be my mathematical model. Now, my mathematical model may be missing something, because actually what's also going to be important in this case is the number of turns of wire that I have around that metal core, and that's missing from this particular mathematical model, but you can go back and revise that. But that's how mathematical models work, is you try to express in mathematical relationships the various components of the model. And if you begin, for example, I go back here to this conceptual system model, I've got these various components and potential interactions and processes that I might try to describe mathematically of how, for example, the chemistry works, and describe that as a mathematical equation. I can put all of those kinds of equations into a computer and step forward and solve them, and in that way create a computational model. And this image is a computational model. This is actually from one of my published papers. This is a computational model of the solar wind flowing past the Earth and its magnetic field, and you can see the little Earth in there and in that void there in the center of the computational domain, and we've got an equatorial plane and a meridional plane, and what are drawn as those yellow lines are actually lines of electric current, and what we were illustrating there is where the electric currents that are formed in the shock wave in front of the Earth, where do they go? But what you're looking at is a visual expression of actually a computational model, because what this computer code does is it takes all of these models for magnetohydrodynamics, all of these equations, and solves them numerically, and depending on the input that we put into the model. So that's really what a computational model is. It's taking some kind of physical system that you've described mathematically and solving those equations on a computer, because there's no way you can solve this analytically. It's just far, far, far too complex. So you've got to find some kind of numerical way of stepping through the calculation to solve it, and then we will visually represent it with some kind of program that renders the simulation results. And that's sort of the highest level of modeling that students will get. Students start to describe systems and models with simple conceptual models or maybe physical models in middle grades. But by 9-12, it's expected that students at least have the rudimentary understanding of what we mean by a mathematical or a computational model. It's not going to be, super complex models like climate models or space weather models, but the vision of the framework and of the NGSS is that I should actually be able to talk to a high school student who has learned about models and system models, and they should be able to understand more or less what I'm telling them when I talk about, the kind of work that I do as a scientist. That's really the vision. That takes us far beyond where we are right now in terms of general science education and understanding of what you mean by a system model, in particular a mathematical or a computational model. Okay, so Ted asks here, can I explain the difference between a numerical solution versus a mathematical solution? So let me give you an example. So let's say I drop an object and I want to know, its position as a function of time. So I can actually, in a pretty straightforward fashion, write down what are the equations of motion, and then I can know what is I have an analytic expression that says, here's the position, height above the floor of the ball as a function of time from the time that I drop that that ball. But I could also express it as as stepping through in time, so that the ball drops at a certain speed, and so in a little increment of time, that's how far it moves. And then in the next little increment of time, that's how far it moves. That would be a computational model, a calculation. I wouldn't do that for dropping the ball because it's very simple and I get an analytic solution. But let's say that I'm going to launch something, say, fire an artillery shell, and I want to know where is it going to come down. Now, there you start to get very, very complicated things, because air resistance doesn't really matter when I'm dropping a ball. But air resistance matters a lot when an object is traveling at high speed through the air, because there's a lot of friction with the air, a lot of air resistance. And it turns out that as soon as you include air resistance, you can't solve the equations analytically. And the only way to get to the solution is to write down the equation and say, okay, here's the force on the object, so here's the change in the motion that it produces in this little time step, and I just keep on advancing that by one little time step after another. That's a computational model. I'm using essentially a calculator to give me a number at each point in time for where's the position of that artillery shell, or of a rocket. I mean, when we design spacecraft trajectories to go out, for example, to the outer planets, these are incredibly complicated orbits. There's no way you can solve it analytically, but what you can do is you can say, okay, at each point, the spacecraft is going to be pulled by these particular objects. These are the objects that are going to exert a gravity force on that spacecraft, and that will tell me, from the force on the spacecraft, that tells me what's going to be the change in the motion. So I let the motion change a little bit, I let the spacecraft move a little bit, and now in its new position, I recalculate what are the forces on the object. And then I advance that solution in time, step by step by step. At each point, I add up all the forces, given the position of the satellite. What's the force on the satellite? That tells me the change in the motion. And I can say, where's the satellite going to be 1 second from now? And you can do incredibly complicated things that way. There was a spacecraft mission that intercepted a comet that involved several flybys by the moon to pick up enough speed by getting basically a gravitational slingshot from the moon until it could intercept the comet. And on the last pass by the moon, the satellite was only a few kilometers off of the surface. Very complicated kind of calculation. Something that could only be done by a computer, where at each point in time you say, well, what are all the forces acting on this thing? And let me just step it forward 1 second in time, or 1 minute, whatever makes sense for your calculation. Okay, so let me see here. Yeah, Ted writes, if I've got a mathematical solution, I can write an equation that tells me, exactly what is the position in time. And oh yes, it is calculus. Okay, so let me ask you, how often do you use this idea of system models in your instruction right now?
Okay, everybody, I've opened up our poll, and you can select from our poll buttons, A through D. Let us know the role of system models in your current instruction. This will be a great one for Ramon to kind of get a sense of how you all are currently using this. So I'll give everybody just another few seconds to respond to this one. And it looks like we've got a lot of responses coming in. Thanks, everybody, for being so quick to respond here. And I will go ahead and lock the responses now, and so we can take a look at what we've got. And I'll turn it back over to you, Ramon.
Okay, so it's a range. I mean, from rarely or never up to occasionally and then with every major science topic. So we've got a pretty broad range here of using system models. I'm noticing one thing in the chat which I want to come back to, which is a very interesting question that David Bernard has posed. So a numeric model could be numbers in a data table, and a mathematical or computational model involves equations. Perhaps. Let me give you an example of a computational model, which is a pretty straightforward numerical calculation, not involving any calculus. We could say that we've got some population of deer and lions, and the deer, you know, they have a mating season, and when they mate, every female deer is going to produce one baby deer. And the lions, they have got a mating season, and every time that they mate, you know, we're going to get a certain number of lions. And then lions eat one deer every 2 days. And so I could write an Excel spreadsheet and start off with a certain number of lions and a certain number of deer, and each line could be, you know, every day. So on day 1, oh, the lions ate one deer, and then on day 2 they weren't hungry, but on day 3 they ate one deer, and each time the number of deer is going down. And then at a certain point the lions are going to have babies, so the number of lions goes up, and then comes the mating season for the deer, and the number of deer go up, and then you've got the lions eating the deer, and you know, so this Excel spreadsheet then, as it develops step by step, each line depends on the previous line. So, for example, in a given line, you know, I'll start off, say, with 100 deer. How many deer will be there the next day? Well, it depends on whether the lions were hungry that day and how many lions there were. If I say each lion eats one deer. So that's an example of a computational numerical model that you could do with an Excel spreadsheet. And you know, we talked about emergent behavior. It turns out that there are some very simple equations for how populations work that lead to behavior that's highly unpredictable, what we call deterministic chaos. You might have heard that phrase before about chaotic behavior. Very simple kinds of relationships like that, like, you know, how many animals in a population given a birth rate, a death rate, and a rate of predation, and then the number of predators, which also has their birth and death rate. That might seem like a pretty simple system. You know, an animal dies, it lives, has a certain lifetime, a certain number are born every year, and a certain number are eaten every year. But you would be surprised that you get very, very complex behavior in those populations out of a simple set of rules like that. Okay, so this is a challenge, you know, how to use system models in instruction, because we have a number of people who really aren't using it that much, and some who are using it quite a bit. And NGSS calls for really using system models more than is in current practice. So for those of you who are practitioners and are thinking how you would deal with this, particularly if you're in a state that's likely to adopt NGSS, I hope that you're able to find more resources about system models, and that there'll be opportunities in your states and in your school districts to think about how to use system models in instruction. And who knows, maybe NSTA will offer some webinars about that. Okay, so now I think I just want to pose the broad issue. What general questions do you have about systems, system models in the framework in NGSS? And I see that we're at 7:45, and I don't know, Bryn, how much time you want for wrap up.
Yes, thanks, Ramon. We can spend about 5 minutes here taking questions before we go to Ted's final slide. So do you want to address the one from Stephen there?
Yeah. Yes, distinction between developing models and using models. Okay, so now we're getting into actually scientific practice of developing and using models. And oftentimes the models that we're talking about are system models. So developing a model is taking observations or taking the way that you thought about your system, the conceptual model that you've created about your system, to develop a representation, the thing that we're calling the model. For example, I showed you the picture of the electromagnet, and then I had a mathematical description of how many paper clips you might be picking up. That mathematical representation is a mathematical model of that physical system. So you're at some point going to be developing these models, but then it's important to be able to use the models, in particular for prediction. That might be both that once you've got a model that you've validated, you can use it to predict something in the future, or you use a model to make predictions and then you test against reality. And if you get a different answer than you were expecting, then that tells you there's something not quite right with your model. Maybe you need to go back to the original system that you defined and ask yourself, did I really include everything in that system that is essential? So developing and using models feeds both ways. I mean, it can be that you've developed a model and now you're using it to predict and to understand other things, or you're developing a model and using it to see to what extent you really are representing reality, to either give you confidence in your original definition of the system and the interactions that were important, or to say, I need to go back and revise my system or include other processes that I didn't have there before because they're important. And Ross says, do we expect students to create models or just understand those that teachers make? Certainly by middle school and high school, even in elementary school, students should be creating models. And now, at times, teachers will provide models, particularly when students are just starting to understand what is a model in the context of a system. But eventually, certainly you expect that students are going to really be creating their own models. And yeah, Ted says model represents a student understanding of the concept, and that is a way to assess. Can a student create a conceptual model that really does reflect all of the pieces and interactions that science says are there? If a student can do that, then that reflects understanding on the part of the student around that particular content. So Bryn, I guess I can turn it back to you for these last 10, 11 minutes.
I'll take a piece here. That's no problem. And I just want to point out, sort of connected with what we're talking about here, we had a very good web seminar last fall on the scientific and engineering practice of developing and using models by Christina Schwartz and Cindy Passmore. And for those of you who are really interested in wrestling with some of these pieces here, I'd recommend that as something to go back and look at our archives of to see. That might help some of the discussions we've got here. But I'm going to take a moment here and just point out a few other elements here. The standards themselves you can find on the website nextgenscience.org. You can also find lots of resources, including those web seminars I'm mentioning on the NSTA website. You can always access it by nsta.org/NGSS. And the conversation can continue two ways. Members, there's access to a member-only listserv dedicated to NGSS. You can get in the NSTA Learning Center. There also is an open discussion forum focused solely on NGSS that provides an opportunity to carry on some of these discussions. And Brent has put those links for both of those up there. We've made it through our whole set of web seminars on cross-cutting concepts. That was the full deck you can see here that we've done. So if you haven't seen all of those, or if want to see some, you can go back into the Learning Center to see them. We also have, as I mentioned, archived some of the web seminars about practices. Going more to something solid in paper, the framework is available right now. You can get it at the NSTA bookstore, as well as a reader's guide to the framework. We all can access the standards online. It's a really great way to look at. The National Academy Press is going to publish a print version of the standards that's due later this summer, and you can pre-order that if you want to. So just get that in place. We also do have a reader's guide to the standards available at the NSTA bookstore. I hope you enjoy your summer, but as you think towards next fall, next school year, we have a number of regional conferences in Portland, Oregon in October, Charlotte, North Carolina in November, and Denver, Colorado in December, as well as our national conference in Boston. For those of you who happen to have the ability to make it to our conference in San Antonio, there were a tremendous number of sessions devoted to NGSS and standing room only. I can promise you that there'll be a huge number of sessions featuring the standards and helping you think about how to work with them at our conferences this coming year. And with that, I will pass things on to Bryn to pull together. I will take one more moment here to let you all know that this is our last web seminar for this school year. We're really thrilled with having all of you who've been able to be involved in seeing some of these. I want to point out two things we're looking at. We're in some discussions now that the website for NGSS is up and fully functional. We probably will this summer do a web seminar that gives you sort of a guided tour of the official NGSS website and gives you a sense of all the features that it has. And we will be coming back in the fall and tackling the core ideas and how you can use the practices to address those core ideas, how you can make connections between the core ideas and the cross-cutting concepts, but focusing on individual pieces there to help you slowly build up your understanding of these standards. And that will be my last point here to pass it on to Bryn.
Thanks a lot, Ted, and a big thank you to both you and to Ramon Lopez for presenting tonight's web seminar. Everyone, let's use our emoticon button, that's the one with the face on it, and click on the clapping hands to give our presenters a round of applause. And thank you so much for everyone for your participation today. We would like to thank the sponsor of today's web seminar, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And a thank you to the administration of NSTA for their support for web seminars. I'd also like to remind everybody about our upcoming calendar. Join us tomorrow, June 12th, for a program in our NASA Explorer School series looking at engineering design process on the Moon Educator Guide. Next week, we've got a NASA program that focuses on NGSS for middle school, relating it to Newton's laws of motion. And on the 20th, we have another popular engineering design focusing on the Great Boomerang Challenge. So go to learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars to register for these programs and more. And we look forward to seeing everybody on another web seminar soon.